Welcome to the debate. Today, we turn our attention to the opening 24 chapters of Herman Melville's Moby Dick, specifically focusing our analysis on the complex portrayal of the whaling industry. The central question before us is this: does this material successfully elevate the whaling industry to a noble, historically progressive, and heroic endeavor, or does it fundamentally expose it as a brutal, hypocritical, and, purely extractive capitalist enterprise? My position is that Melville genuinely frames whaling as a majestic, world-shaping pursuit that completely dwarfs traditional forms of heroism.
Right. And I will argue that the narrative actively subverts this romanticism, revealing an industry built entirely on bloody exploitation, unvarnished greed, and religious hypocrisy.
Let us begin with the foundational framing of the Whaleman. If we look particularly at chapter 24, which is fittingly titled The Advocate, there is an earnest and I'd say comprehensive defense of whaling's nobility. Melville explicitly positions whalemen as the true pioneers of the globe. I mean, it is the whale ship that opened up Australia, South America, and Polynesia.
Well, sure, but
Hold on. Let me just finish the thought. These men accomplished what lauded, celebrated explorers like Cook and Krusenstern simply could not, because in their absolute, succorless empty-handedness, they battled virgin wonders and terrors that traditional navies would never dare approach.
I come at it from a completely different way. While that grand rhetoric certainly exists in the text, it functions as a mask for a profoundly grim reality. The narrative employs deep, systemic irony to critique the very industry it pretends to elevate. This supposed nobility is immediately undercut by the ruthless capitalism embodied by the Pequod's owners, Captains Peleg and Bildad.
But you can't ignore the global impact Melville is establishing here. He emphasizes both the literal and metaphorical light they bring to the world. All the tapers, lamps, and candles burning around the globe, the very illumination of modern society, burn to the glory of the whalemen. He openly addresses the charge that whaling is just a butchering sort of business and masterfully counters it by reminding us that martial commanders, whose only harvest is human death, are celebrated as heroes. A butcher of whales is elevated far above a butcher of men. It makes an undeniable case for the historical and moral progression driven by the industry.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. That grand defense of bringing light to the world completely falls apart when you look at how the sausage, or in this case, the whale oil, is actually made. Consider Bildad. Here is a man who uses his strict Quaker piety as a literal shield to justify extreme economic stinginess. He sits on the deck reading scripture about not laying our treasures on earth, while simultaneously offering Ishmael the insulting 777th lay.
Let's clarify that for a moment, because the compensation structure is unique here.
Exactly. For some context, whalers weren't paid a flat salary. They were paid a lay, which was a tiny fraction of the ship's total profits upon a successful return. By offering the 777th lay, Bildad is essentially asking a completely inexperienced young man, a green hand, to risk his life for literal pennies. And how does Bildad justify this exploitation? By claiming he must protect the widows and orphans who invested in the ship. It's an incredibly modern critique of venture capitalism. He is privatizing the financial gains for the owners while socializing the extreme bodily risks among the workers.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. We must look at how the character of the whaleman himself is built, independent of those shore-bound financiers. In chapter 14, which focuses on Nantucket, Melville spends an entire chapter building this soaring argument that Nantucketers are completely exceptional. He actually compares them to Alexander's conquering the watery world. They are not merely employees of an industry. They are sea hermits who boldly claim 2/3 of the globe as their own.
But sea hermits is such a romanticized term for men who are essentially trapped on a wooden boat for 3 years.
It is romantic, yes, but it's earned. Melville gives us this incredible image of them climbing the massive waves the exact same way mountain hunters climb the Alps. He's framing them not as a subjugated blue-collar workforce, but as absolute masters of this terrifying environment. They parcel out the oceans among themselves, exactly as emperors own empires. This is the elevation of the whaleman to a sovereign, almost mythic status, achieving a mastery over the natural world that land-bound monarchs could only dream of.
You bring up the supposed sovereignty of the whaleman, but if we look at what happens the second Ishmael steps onto the deck, that sovereignty completely evaporates. The Alexander's rhetoric is beautiful poetry, but it totally ignores the brutal power dynamics enforcing the labor.
You're referring to Captain Peleg's management style.
If you want to call physical assault a management style, yes. We are presented with Peleg violently kicking Ishmael, using actual physical violence to enforce obedience. Peleg screams at the men, threatening to break their backbones if they don't spring to the windlass. And we are told about Bildad's history as a commander, how he exhausted his crews to the point that when they finally arrived home, they were mostly all carried ashore to the hospital, completely worn out.
It's undeniably harsh labor. No one is disputing that.
It's more than harsh, it's predatory. The nobility of the sea hermit is a delusion. It is a romantic narrative fed to marginalized people, to indigenous islanders, and to green Vermonters who show up in their naive little swallow-tailed coats thinking they are going on an adventure. They are lured in solely to feed an industrial meat grinder. The narrative sets up the myth only to show us the stark, exploitative reality underneath.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently. The narrative does not shy away from the harshness of the labor, but it frames that very harshness as the crucible necessary for true heroism. Even the violence of whaling, that butcher label you alluded to earlier, is defended. The violence is not portrayed as mere industrial slaughter. It is an epic battle against what Melville calls the Himalayan salt sea mastodon.
Meaning they are fighting prehistoric-level sea monsters.
Exactly. They aren't just processing meat. They are engaging in mythological combat. To do this work requires confronting the interlinked terrors and wonders of God. It becomes a spiritually elevating trial. If you want proof of the noble character forged by this life, look directly at Queequeg in Chapter 13.
Oh, the rescue scene on the package ship.
Yes. A young, completely inexperienced bumpkin had just been openly mocking Queequeg. Moments later, the boom sweeps that same greenhorn overboard into the freezing, turbulent ocean. Queequeg does not hesitate for a second. He dives in and performs a miraculous, superhuman physical feat to save a man who had just insulted him. And my absolute favorite detail, when he returns to the deck, he just casually asks for some fresh water to wash the brine off. He acts like he just finished a light jog, rather than having just performed a legendary rescue. That specific moment proves that the environment of the whale ship produces a magnanimity and a moral physical courage that simply does not exist in the petty world of the shore.
That is undeniably a beautiful moment for Queequeg as an individual. But to map his personal intrinsic nobility onto the commercial industry that is actively exploiting him is a massive mistake. Queequeg is noble in spite of the industry, not because of it.
I don't see how you can separate the two. The ocean is the arena that allows his greatness to manifest.
Because the overarching shadow of senseless death completely mocks this idea of industry-wide heroism. Look at the bleak reality presented in the Whaleman's Chapel in Chapter 7. Ishmael's walking around reading these marble plaques on the walls. We are confronted with the despair of widows mourning men who have placelessly perished without a grave. There is a specific, profound existential dread tied to dying at sea and being swallowed by the ocean with no marker. The narrative asks us to confront the deadly voids and unbidden infidelities in the lines that seem to gnaw upon all faith. That is the true guaranteed harvest of whaling.
But the ever-present reality of death is exactly what elevates the profession. Facing that void is what separates the whaleman from the land dweller.
Is it elevating or is it just apocalyptic? Let's talk about the Tripod's Inn, where Ishmael and Queequeg stay, and Nantucket. It's named after the massive cauldrons used to boil down whale blubber. The inn literally features 2 enormous black pots suspended from a topmast, and Ishmael notes that it looks exactly like a gallows. This is an industry entirely saturated in death imagery.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because you're interpreting foreshadowing as condemnation. The danger is acknowledged, but it's met with a spiritual fortitude.
Then what about the ragged prophet Elijah in chapter 19? He stops Ishmael and Queequeg on the docks to deliver cryptic warnings about Ahab's deadly scrimmage and the captain's lost leg. Elijah's presence suggests that the violence they are sailing toward is not a noble, spiritually elevating trial, but rather a cursed, doomed compulsion. The voyage is tainted before the ship even slips its moorings. The industry isn't producing heroes, it's producing corpses and broken men like Ahab, whose missing leg is a testament to the sheer, indifferent violence of the enterprise.
You're touching on the spiritual element, but I think you're misreading the spiritual alignment of the journey. The text specifically aligns the whaling journey with a higher spiritual duty rather than a cursed compulsion. That chapel scene you referenced earlier absolutely must be viewed in tandem with Father Mapple's sermon in chapter 9.
The sermon about Jonah and the whale?
Precisely. That sermon establishes the ultimate moral duty in this universe, to preach truth to the face of falsehood. Mapple frames the voyage and Jonah's terrifying relationship with the whale as the ultimate test of obeying God rather than fleeing into the comfortable corruption of the world. In this framing, true morality and transcendent human connection actually flourish away from the shore's corruption.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered that the industry itself fundamentally perverts and weaponizes the very religion you are talking about?
How so? The purity of connection on the ship seems quite distinct from the shore. Look at the bosom friendship between Ishmael and Queequeg. They bridge a massive religious and cultural divide. They share a pipe, a bed, and Queequeg even splits his 30 pieces of silver with Ishmael. This profound spiritual unity happens precisely because they are entering the realm of the Whaleman. The ocean becomes the only space where authentic, unvarnished truth can exist, entirely free from the hypocrisies of land-based society.
You're highlighting the workers again. Yes, Ishmael and Queequeg find solidarity. Workers often do when faced with brutal conditions. But let's look at how religion is actually practiced by the men running the industry. Father Mapple's sermon is powerful poetry, but what is the practical reality? Captain Peleg explicitly states that pious harpooneers never make good voyagers. Why? Because religion takes the shark out of them.
Peleg is certainly a pragmatist.
He's explicitly telling us that the industry requires men to be sharks. It demands a violent, predatory nature, and the hypocrisy is just grotesque. Let's return to Bildad and the negotiation of Queequeg's pay. Bildad tries to ruthlessly cheat Queequeg, who is clearly an elite, veteran harpooner. He offers him the 90th lay, which is still absurdly low, and only does so because Peleg literally forces the issue.
True. Peleg has to step in to ensure a slightly fairer wage so they don't lose a master harpooner.
But look at what happens immediately after that negotiation. Bildad has the absolute audacity to hand Queequeg a religious tract entitled The Latter Day Coming. He warns the son of darkness to avoid the fiery pit right after actively trying to rob him blind. The structural reality of the Pequod is that it demands blood, extreme physical exhaustion, and maximum profit, making an absolute mockery of its owner's supposed Quaker nonviolence. Religion on the Pequod is not a path to transcendent truth. It is a tool of management used to pacify the conscience of the exploiters while they extract labor.
That reading treats the shore financiers as the totality of the enterprise, but once the Pequod leaves Nantucket, Bildad and Peleg are left behind. The ship becomes its own world. To briefly summarize my position in light of our discussion, the material undeniably presents a highly complex, often dangerous world, but it ultimately succeeds in painting the whaleman as a tragic, majestic figure essential to global progress. Through its soaring rhetoric, its framing of the ocean as an empire, and its depiction of the profound physical and moral courage required to face the Leviathan, Melville argues that the whaling enterprise demands a greatness of spirit that traditional terrestrial pursuits simply cannot match.
The brutality you highlighted absolutely exists, but it is the very mechanism that elevates these men to the level of myth.
And to summarize my perspective, the narrative simultaneously exposes the horrific human cost, the systemic greed, and the religious hypocrisy fueling that very progress. The beautiful rhetoric about Alexanders and bringing light to the world is consistently undercut by the grim economic realities of the lays, the clear exploitation of inexperienced green hands and indigenous laborers, and the omnipresent suffocating specter of senseless death. The industry does not elevate men. It consumes them for profit, hiding its brutality behind the performative piety of men like Bildad.
We can certainly find common ground in the understanding that the Pequod serves as a brilliant, incredibly dense microcosm of human ambition and society. It captures the entirety of the human condition, the soaring nobility and the base greed within the wooden bulwarks of a single ship. Our continued disagreement clearly lies in whether the narrative ultimately forgives the brutality for the sake of the heroism, or if it fundamentally condemns the heroism as a carefully constructed facade for the brutality.
Precisely. And this reflects the immense value of looking at foundational material through multiple lenses. Navigating the constant, uncomfortable tension between ideological grandeur and harsh economic reality is absolutely essential to understanding the depth of this work fully. There's always more to explore when we start questioning the narratives of heroism and progress presented to us.
Indeed, we leave the listener to weigh the text's majestic claims against its harsh realities and form their own conclusion. Thank you for joining us for this discussion.